I never imagined that a routine babysitting job could turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. My name is Lisa, I'm 20 years old, and I've been babysitting for a few years now. You know, nothing too unusual, just watching kids while their parents go out for dinner or an event, making sure everyone's in bed by 9, and then zoning out in front of the TV until they come home. But this job, this one was different. I was hired by the Graysons, a wealthy family living on the outskirts of town. They had 2 kids, James, who was about 8, and Jessica, who was only 5. The Graysons lived in this enormous, modern mansion, the kind of place that makes you feel small and out of place the moment you step inside. They were polite, but distant, busy people, always on the move. They told me they needed someone to watch the kids on weekends when they traveled for work or business trips. I didn't ask too many questions. The pay was great, and the house had all the luxuries a college student could dream of: a huge flat-screen TV, a fridge stocked with gourmet food, and even a guest bedroom for me to stay in. I'd been babysitting for them for about a month when that weekend came. It was a quiet Friday evening, the parents had just left for one of their trips, and everything seemed normal. Jessica and James were a little restless, as kids usually are at night, but after a few games of hide and seek, some snacks, and a Disney movie, I got them to bed around 9:30 p.m. I settled into the guest room, scrolling through my phone, and feeling pretty relaxed. But then, around midnight, I started to hear noises. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. You know how big houses are, creaks and groans that don't mean anything. I brushed it off and kept browsing Instagram, trying to ignore the faint, almost rhythmic sounds coming from downstairs. But after a few minutes the noise changed. It wasn't random creaks anymore. It was something more deliberate. Like footsteps. I froze, staring at the door, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. Maybe James or Jessica had gotten out of bed. That had to be it, I told myself, and I got up to check on them. I crept down the hallway, and just as I reached the kids' room, I heard a soft whimper from inside. It was Jessica. I pushed the door open gently and found her sitting up in bed, her wide eyes reflecting the dim glow of her nightlight. "Lisa," she whispered, clutching her stuffed bunny. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my heart racing, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, I heard it. It's probably just the wind or something." She shook her head, her small voice trembling. "No, it was footsteps. I heard someone walking." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I couldn't let her see that I was scared though, so I forced a smile. "It's nothing, sweetie. Go back to sleep, okay?" Jessica didn't look convinced, but she lay back down, still clutching her bunny, and I pulled the blanket up to her chin. As I left the room, I pulled the door closed just enough so I could still peek in and check on her. I made my way downstairs, moving slowly, my ears straining for any sound. The house was dark and quiet, too quiet. I flipped on a few lights as I made my way through the first floor, checking the kitchen, the living room, the study. Everything was in place. No sign of anything unusual. But then, as I stood in the middle of the massive foyer, I heard it again, footsteps. This time, coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway leading to the back of the house. I stood there for a moment, frozen, listening to the deafening silence. I didn't know what to do. I was scared, but I didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was just the pipes or some animal outside. I was in a huge house in the middle of nowhere, after all. I decided to head back upstairs, convincing myself that it was all in my head. As I reached the top of the stairs, though, my phone rang. It was loud, almost startling me, and I quickly grabbed it. It was my friend, Sarah, calling to check in. "Hey, everything alright?" she asked, her voice casual. I wanted to brush it off, say everything was fine, but something in me cracked. "Sarah, I'm hearing things. Like, I don't know how to explain it, but I think there's someone in the house." There was a pause on the other end. "Lisa, you're alone in that big creepy house, of course you're freaked out. It's probably nothing." "Yeah, maybe. I said, but even as I said it, I didn't believe it. I walked over to one of the windows in the hallway, still on the phone with Sarah, peering out into the dark yard below. And that's when I saw him. A man, standing in the shadows, just outside the window. His face was pale, almost ghostly in the moonlight, and he was watching me. Our eyes met, and for a second, I was frozen in terror. Then, without thinking, I screamed into the phone. "Sarah, there's someone here! I'm calling the police!" I slammed the window shut and ran into the kids' room, locking the door behind me. Jessica and James were both awake now, their eyes wide with fear as I dialed 911, my hands trembling. "911, what's your emergency?" The operator's calm voice felt surreal against the chaos I was feeling. "There's a man outside," I stammered, trying to keep my voice low so the kids wouldn't panic. "He's trying to get into the house." The operator stayed calm, asking me questions, telling me to stay inside and keep the doors locked. "Officers are on their way," she assured me, but those words did little to comfort me in the moment. I could feel my heart racing, could hear Jessica quietly sobbing next to her brother. The minutes felt like hours as we huddled together, waiting, listening for any sign of movement. Would he try to break in? Should I run for the door? Every sound made me jump, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. And then we heard it. A loud thud, coming from downstairs. That thud. It echoed through the house, so loud it might have come from right beneath us. My stomach twisted, and I pressed the kids closer to me, their small bodies trembling against my sides. My mind raced. Could he have gotten in? I whispered into the phone, trying to stay calm. "I think he's inside the house." The 911 operator kept her voice steady, but I could hear the concern creeping into her tone. "Stay where you are. The police are just minutes away." Minutes away. That felt like a lifetime. I glanced around the room, my eyes settling on the only other exit, the window. But it was too high. I couldn't risk getting the kids hurt. We had no choice but to stay put and hope that the door held if he tried to come in. Suddenly, the silence broke again, but this time it wasn't just a noise. It was a voice. Faint, almost muffled, coming from downstairs. I strained to hear it, but my body stiffened as soon as I recognized what it was. He was calling out. "Jessica! James!" He knew their names. The way he said it, like he was trying to lure them out. There was a calmness to his voice, but it sent chills down my spine. Who the hell was this guy? Jessica whimpered softly beside me, and I held her tighter. "Don't move. Don't make a sound," I whispered to both of them. The footsteps grew louder now, deliberate. Closer. I could hear him making his way through the house. I imagined him wandering from room to room, checking each door, his patience unshakable, knowing he had all the time in the world. And then, without warning, the door handle to the room we were in rattled. I almost screamed. My heart stopped. He was here. The handle jiggled again, and this time, harder. The door shook on its hinges as he tested it, trying to see if he could force his way in. I stared at the door, waiting for it to burst open, praying it would hold. Jessica buried her face in my arm, trying to muffle her sobs. James was shaking, wide-eyed, frozen in fear. I was holding my breath, waiting for the worst. And then, nothing. The rattling stopped. The air was thick with tension, like time had paused just long enough to make me think he'd moved on. But I knew better. He was still out there, waiting, lurking. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and hope the door would keep us safe. Just as I was reaching for the phone again to see how close the police were, I heard the loud bang of a door slamming shut downstairs. Footsteps, hurried now, running away from the house. Was he gone? For a moment, all was still. I barely dared to breathe, but the eerie silence didn't last. In the distance, I could finally make out the sound of sirens. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the walls, and a wave of relief washed over me. They're here. The police are here. I whispered to the kids, standing up cautiously. I still didn't dare open the door, not until I was sure. Seconds later there was a pounding on the front door, followed by voices, real, comforting voices. Police! Is anyone inside? I bolted for the door, throwing it open, my legs nearly giving out as I rushed to the top of the stairs. Up here! We're up here! The officers stormed in, sweeping through the house, guns drawn. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I let it out in a shaky gasp. Within minutes, they confirmed what I had feared. Whoever that man was, he was gone. The back door had been pried open, probably how he got in, and they found muddy footprints leading through the yard, disappearing into the woods behind the house. I was shaking as I stood in the foyer, trying to explain to the police what had happened. Jessica and James clung to me, silent, their eyes wide with fear. I couldn't let go of them. I couldn't even think straight. He was outside first. I told one of the officers, my voice barely above a whisper. I saw him through the window. He was just standing there, watching us. And then he got in somehow. He knew the kids' names. The officer's face grew serious as he listened. We'll search the area. Whoever this guy is, we'll find him. They took my statement, checked every inch of the house, and promised to keep a patrol car outside for the rest of the night. But I knew I couldn't stay here. Not after what had happened. I couldn't even imagine sleeping in this place, knowing he had been so close. After the police left, I packed up a few things and called the Graysons. The father answered, groggy and confused at first, but the moment I told him about the intruder, he was wide awake. We'll be on the first flight back, Mr. Grayson said, his voice sharp with panic. Take the kids to a hotel. We'll meet you there. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Jessica and James, throwing a few of their things into a bag, and drove straight to a hotel nearby. I didn't care about the cost. I just needed to get us out of that house. The hours that followed were a blur. The kids finally fell asleep, exhausted from the fear and chaos, but I couldn't rest. I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering if I had missed something. Who was that man? Why was he there? And how did he know the kids' names? The Graysons arrived early the next morning, their faces pale with worry. They thanked me repeatedly, but I could tell they were as shaken as I was. They pressed charges with the police, but I never found out what happened after that. The man, whoever he was, disappeared into the night, leaving no trace. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on. But I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face through that window, his eyes locking onto mine, like he knew something about me, something I didn't understand. I quit babysitting after that. I just couldn't do it anymore. The memory of that night haunted me, the fear creeping back every time I thought I'd moved past it. But the worst part, I never found out how he knew their names. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear his voice echoing in my head. Jessica. James. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Just me, my beagle Reggie, and the vast expanse of the northern woods. I had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks. After a stressful few months at work, I needed to unwind, to disconnect from the world. Camping always had a way of grounding me. There's something about the simplicity of being in nature, the crackling of the fire, and the stillness of the trees that makes you feel small, in a good way. The day I left, the weather was perfect. It was late fall, and the forest was a tapestry of burnt oranges, deep reds, and earthy browns. The air was crisp but not too cold, just enough to feel refreshing. I loaded up my truck with my gear, tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for a few days, and of course Reggie. He was just as excited as I was, his tail wagging furiously as we drove out of town. The woods I chose were part of a local state park, about a 2-hour drive from where I lived. I'd been there a few times before but never alone. I wasn't particularly worried though. I had all the necessary supplies, and Reggie was a great companion, alert and protective when he needed to be, even though he was small. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I found a clearing about a mile from the parking lot, far enough to feel isolated but not so far that it would be difficult to get back in case of an emergency. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. It was exactly what I needed. I set up the tent while Reggie sniffed around, exploring every inch of our new temporary home. After getting everything in place, I built a small fire, just enough to cook dinner and provide a little warmth as the night air cooled. Reggie curled up beside me, content, his eyes half closed but still alert. As night fell, the forest grew eerily quiet. I'd been camping enough times to know that this wasn't unusual. Animals tend to settle down at night, and the forest often becomes this serene, almost otherworldly place. But there was something different about this quiet. It felt off, like the woods were holding their breath. Still, I pushed the thought aside. It had been a long drive, and I was tired. After finishing dinner, I put out the fire and crawled into the tent with Reggie. I drifted off fairly quickly, lulled to sleep by the distant hooting of an owl and the gentle rustling of the trees. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up to Reggie growling. Not barking, just a low, deep growl that I hadn't heard from him before. My heart immediately started racing. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, careful not to make too much noise. Reggie was standing stiff, his ears perked up and his eyes locked on something in the darkness. I scanned the tree line with the flashlight, but saw nothing. No animals, no people, just the trees swaying slightly in the breeze. I tried to calm Reggie down, but he wasn't having it. He kept growling, his eyes never leaving whatever it was he thought he saw. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Light, but unmistakable. They were coming from the direction of the trail that led deeper into the woods. I froze, listening intently, trying to figure out how many people there were. It sounded like at least 2, maybe more, but it was hard to tell. The footsteps were deliberate, not like someone accidentally wandering too close to my campsite. Whoever it was, they were walking with purpose. I turned off the flashlight and crouched down, hoping that whoever it was hadn't seen my light. Reggie was still growling, but quieter now, as if he sensed that we needed to be silent. My mind raced with possibilities. Were they just other campers? Rangers? Or something else? The footsteps stopped. Whoever it was, they were close. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any more sounds, but the forest had gone completely still again. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I waited, crouched in the tent, for what felt like an eternity, but no more footsteps came. Finally, after what must have been at least an hour, I started to relax. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe they were just passing through and didn't even notice my campsite. I crawled back into the sleeping bag, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. Reggie eventually calmed down, but every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard something. A twig snapping, leaves rustling, nothing concrete, but enough to keep me on edge. By morning, I had almost convinced myself that I had overreacted. The daylight made everything feel normal again. The woods were peaceful, and there was no sign of anyone having been near the campsite. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't get rid of. After breakfast, I decided to move my campsite a little deeper into the woods, just in case. I didn't want to be so close to the main trail where anyone could stumble across me. I found a new spot about half a mile away, more secluded and surrounded by thicker trees. It took a while to pack up and move everything, but I felt better once I was settled in the new location. As the day went on, I tried to relax. Reggie seemed fine, happily trotting around the new campsite, sniffing at the trees and chasing squirrels. But every so often, he'd stop and stare into the distance, his ears twitching like he was picking up on something I couldn't hear. I tried to shake it off. I was here to relax, after all. But deep down, I knew that whatever had been out there last night wasn't just my imagination. Something, or someone, was out there. And they knew I was here. As the sun began to set on that second evening, I felt an uncomfortable tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. The light filtering through the trees took on an eerie orange glow, and shadows stretched long across the ground, creeping toward my campsite like dark fingers. Even Reggie seemed unsettled. He was pacing more than usual, his ears twitching at the slightest sounds in the distance. I tried to shake the feeling of dread creeping into my chest. I gathered some firewood and started a small fire to cook dinner. The crackling of the flames usually soothed me, but tonight, even that familiar sound couldn't drown out the unease that had been building since the previous night. My mind kept replaying the footsteps I had heard, the way they had stopped so close to my tent, the silence that followed. As the fire popped and sparked, I fed Reggie, hoping a full stomach would calm him down. But he barely touched his food, his attention focused on the dark woods surrounding us. His nose was in the air, sniffing at something I couldn't see. Every so often, he'd let out a low growl, his eyes narrowing as if he was trying to pinpoint something out there in the trees. I kept glancing around, shining my flashlight into the shadows, but there was nothing. No movement. No figures lurking. Just the wind rustling through the leaves, the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. Every time I heard a sound, my heart raced, but I told myself it was just the forest settling in for the night. Nature has a way of making noises that seem sinister in the dark, especially when you're alone. But as the night wore on, things began to escalate. It started with the whistling. Soft at first, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. I thought it might just be the wind, a fluke sound carried on a breeze. But then it happened again, louder this time, distinct, like someone was whistling a tune. The melody was strange, off-key and slow, as if whoever was whistling didn't quite know the song. I froze, my body tensing as I listened. Reggie's ears perked up, and he let out a series of sharp barks, facing the direction of the noise. His fur bristled, his body rigid with alertness. I turned off my flashlight, plunging the campsite into darkness, hoping that whatever, or whoever, was out there wouldn't notice me. The whistling stopped, replaced by the silence of the forest once again. Then the footsteps returned. This time, they were heavier, closer than the night before. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, the snap of branches as someone, or something, moved through the underbrush. My mind raced with possibilities. It could be a wild animal. It could be another camper wandering too close. But deep down, I knew that neither of those explanations made sense. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, as if whoever was out there was taking their time, making sure I knew they were coming. Reggie was beside himself, barking ferociously now, pulling at his leash as if he wanted to chase whatever was out there. I tried to quiet him, but my own fear was making it hard to think clearly. I had a hunting knife in my backpack, but I didn't want to provoke whoever, or whatever, was lurking in the darkness. Instead, I yelled out into the night, hoping to scare them off. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice sounding more panicked than I'd intended. "Who's out there?" No response. Just more footsteps, still approaching, still slow. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it back on, sweeping the beam across the tree-line. For a moment I thought I saw movement, just a flicker of something darting between the trees. A figure? A shadow? I couldn't be sure. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and I felt like the walls of the forest were closing in around me. Then, in the distance, the scream cut through the night. It was a woman's scream, high-pitched, filled with terror. The sound was so sudden, so piercing, that it felt like it had stabbed straight into my chest. Reggie stopped barking, his body going stiff, his eyes wide with fear. My whole body went cold. I couldn't tell where the scream had come from, but it was somewhere deep in the woods, beyond the reach of my flashlight. I didn't wait to hear it again. I grabbed Reggie's leash and yanked him toward the truck. We sprinted through the darkness, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand as we ran. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The trail back to the parking lot felt longer than it should have, every rustle in the trees sending my mind into a frenzy of panic. I kept expecting to hear footsteps chasing us, or worse, to hear that eerie whistling again. But there was nothing, just the pounding of my feet on the trail, Reggie's frantic panting beside me, and the oppressive darkness of the woods surrounding us. When we finally reached the truck, I threw open the door and shoved Reggie inside, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. As soon as the engine roared to life, I floored it, speeding down the dirt road that led out of the park. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, chasing us. But the road was empty. We were alone. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the main highway, the lights of civilization finally in view. Only then did I pull over to catch my breath, my hands still trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. Reggie was curled up in the passenger seat, shaking just as much as I was. His usual energetic demeanor was gone, replaced by a quiet, fearful stillness. I called the non-emergency police number as soon as I could, trying to explain what had happened, though it sounded crazier out loud than it had in my head. The officer I spoke to was polite but dismissive. They promised to send someone out to check the area, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. Probably just some kids messing around, they said. But I knew better. I never went back to those woods. In fact, I haven't been camping since. That sense of being watched, of not being alone out there, it's something I can't shake, even now. I still hear that whistling sometimes, in my dreams. And every time I do, I wake up in a cold sweat, Reggie whimpering beside me. Whatever, or whoever, was out there that night, they weren't just messing around. They were hunting. It was one of those gloomy, rainy nights when the world outside felt distant and muffled. I could hear the soft patter of rain against the windows, the kind of sound that could lull anyone into a sense of calm. Except tonight, that sound wasn't comforting at all. I was home alone for the weekend, my parents out of town visiting some old friends. They left me in charge of the house, something I'd usually relish, but on nights like this, it felt more like a curse than freedom. Our house is a split level, with my room up on the top floor. From the windows, I could barely make out the dim street lights flickering through the rain. The house itself was dead quiet, except for the movie I was watching. I decided to watch a horror film, because why not? It was a Friday night, and I didn't have anything better to do. Looking back, maybe that wasn't the best choice, but I never believed in that whole "don't watch scary movies when you're home alone" superstition. At least, not until that night. I was about halfway through the movie when I heard it. A noise that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just part of the film, a door creaking open or some other cliché horror sound effect. But then I realized it wasn't coming from the TV at all. No, it came from downstairs. A faint, unmistakable thud, like the back door closing. I paused the movie, my heart pounding harder than I wanted to admit. I strained my ears, listening for any other sounds, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind or something perfectly explainable. But then came another noise, this time closer. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my phone and quickly texted my family group chat, asking if anyone had come home early. I stared at the screen, waiting for a response that would tell me I was being paranoid. But nothing. My parents were still out, as they had been all weekend. There was no one else supposed to be in the house. The footsteps continued. I could hear them moving through the lower level of the house, faint but unmistakable. I froze, unsure of what to do. Should I go down and check? Maybe it was just something falling over. Maybe I'd left a window open and the wind was playing tricks on me. But then the footsteps stopped at the base of the stairs. My heart was hammering in my chest so loudly I thought I might not be able to hear anything else. But I did. I heard the faint creak of the stairs as the footsteps started moving up, one step at a time, slowly but surely. I didn't dare move. My eyes were locked on my bedroom door, which was slightly ajar, casting a narrow strip of light onto the floor. I could feel my breathing getting shallow, my mind racing with the possibility that someone, or something, was inside my house, creeping toward my room. And then, the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. The door creaked open just a little more. My body tensed as I caught sight of a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, tall, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. His clothes were soaked from the rain, and his eyes were fixed on me, staring with a blank expression that sent a shiver down my spine. For a moment, neither of us moved. He just stood there, watching me, while I sat frozen on my bed, clutching my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat, trapped by sheer terror. Finally, I managed to move. With trembling hands, I dialed 911 and whispered into the phone, trying not to make any sudden movements. "There's someone in my house," I murmured, barely able to get the words out. The operator asked me to stay on the line, but just as I did, the man at the door turned around and walked away, disappearing back down the hallway. I could still hear the sound of his footsteps, growing fainter as he moved away from my room. I stayed on the phone, whispering every movement he made, praying that the police would arrive before he came back. But I didn't hear him leave. The front door never opened, and I didn't hear the sound of him going down the stairs. It felt like an eternity before the police finally arrived, their lights flashing outside through the rain-soaked windows. I stayed on the phone until I heard them knock on the door, and then I rushed downstairs, unlocking it as fast as I could, almost tripping over my own feet in my panic. The officers came inside, searching the entire house. I stayed in the kitchen, feeling the cold tiles beneath my bare feet as I waited for them to find something, anything, that would explain what had just happened. But after several minutes of searching, they came back with nothing. There was no one in the house. Part 2: The Stranger in the Shadows. The police left after reassuring me that everything was fine, but nothing about that night felt fine. I stood by the window, watching their car disappear into the distance, the sound of the rain growing louder in their absence. My body was still shaking, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Where did he go? Who was he? And more importantly, why? I locked every door and window in the house, double-checking each one, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there. Somewhere. Watching. Waiting. My heart pounded in my chest every time I thought about that man standing in my doorway, staring at me like I was some kind of, I don't know, prey? Target? The look in his eyes was something I couldn't forget, no matter how hard I tried. I texted my parents again, telling them what happened, but I didn't want to freak them out too much, so I downplayed it. Told them the police said it was probably just a drifter, maybe someone looking for shelter from the rain. They believed it, or at least they acted like they did, and told me to stay safe until they got home the next day. But I knew it was more than that. It had to be. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump, every creak of the house sent my imagination spiraling. I kept replaying that moment in my head, the man standing in my doorway, soaking wet from the rain, staring at me with those empty eyes. It was like he was waiting for something. But what? Around 2 a.m., I decided to get up and check the locks again. Call it paranoia, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I walked down the stairs, I glanced out the window, and that's when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of our backyard, right near the tree line. Just standing there, looking up at the house. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was him, the same man from earlier. His clothes were still wet, and his figure was barely visible in the darkness, but I could see enough to know it was him. He hadn't left. He'd been out there the whole time. A wave of panic washed over me. I ran back upstairs and locked myself in my room, my heart racing. I didn't call the police again. I didn't know what they could do. They hadn't found anything the first time, and he was outside now, not inside. But that didn't make me feel any safer. In fact, it made everything worse. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound, my eyes constantly darting to the window. When morning finally came, I went downstairs, cautiously peeking out the windows to see if he was still there. But he was gone. No sign of him anywhere. When my parents got home later that day, I told them everything. This time, I didn't hold back. My dad wanted to call the police again, but I told him not to bother. The man was gone, and the last thing I wanted was more empty reassurances. But that feeling of being watched? It never really went away. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to normal. At least on the surface. I went back to school, hung out with my friends, did all the things I was supposed to do. But every night, when I lay in bed, I could still feel his presence, like he was out there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment. And then one night, a few weeks after the incident, I woke up to the sound of footsteps again. This time, though, they weren't downstairs. They were right outside my window. The sound of footsteps outside my window sent a jolt of terror through my body. I froze, lying completely still in my bed, every muscle tense and my heart thudding so loudly I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. The footsteps were faint, but steady, as if someone was pacing back and forth just beneath my window. It didn't make any sense. My room was on the second floor. There shouldn't be anyone outside my window, there couldn't be. But the rhythmic crunch of feet on gravel, slow and deliberate, made it impossible to deny. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, trying to will away the fear, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the wind or the rain or my overactive imagination. But then it came again, clear, unmistakable, the sound of footsteps, right under my window. With trembling hands I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers fumbling over the screen as I unlocked it. My first instinct was to call 911 again, but something inside me hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if, like before, they found no one, and I was left feeling foolish and paranoid? But this time felt different. This time, the sound was too real, too close. I forced myself to move, inching towards the edge of the bed, trying to make as little noise as possible. I didn't dare turn on any lights. My room was dark, save for the faint glow from the streetlights outside, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I crept over to the window, my heart pounding harder with every step. When I reached the window, I hesitated for a long moment. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what, or who, might be out there. But I had to know. Slowly, carefully, I inched the curtain aside and peered out into the darkness. At first I saw nothing. Just the backyard, slick and glistening from the rain, and the faint outline of trees in the distance. But then my eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I saw him. He was standing just beneath the tree line, his figure barely visible in the shadows. But it was unmistakable, his tall, soaked frame, the same man who had been in my house that night. He was facing the house, staring up at my window with that same blank, unsettling expression. He wasn't moving, wasn't pacing anymore, just standing there staring, as if he had been waiting for me to notice him. A wave of cold dread washed over me. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. How long had he been standing there? Why was he still here weeks later? My mind raced with questions, but I didn't have time to dwell on them. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone and rushed out of my room, my feet barely making a sound on the carpeted floor. I ran down the hall and into the guest bedroom, which also had a view of the backyard. I needed to keep an eye on him while I figured out what to do next. From the guest bedroom window, I could still see him, standing motionless at the edge of the yard. He hadn't moved. It was almost as if he knew I was watching him, and he was waiting for me to make the next move. With trembling hands, I dialed 911 again. This time, there was no hesitation. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, steady. There's someone outside my house, I whispered, my voice shaking. He's been here before. He was inside my house a few weeks ago. He's standing in the backyard, just watching. Stay on the line with me, the operator said. Officers are on their way. Can you see the man now? Yes, I said, glancing out the window again. He's still there, by the trees. The operator asked me to describe him, and I did my best, though my words were shaky. I couldn't get the image of his cold, vacant stare out of my head. It felt like those eyes were boring into me, even from the distance. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The rain had started to pick up again, a soft, steady drizzle that blurred the outlines of everything outside. I kept my eyes on him, half expecting him to vanish into the shadows like before. But he didn't. He just stood there, a dark silhouette against the misty backdrop of the trees, completely unmoving. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder as they approached. Relief washed over me. The police were coming. They would catch him this time, and this nightmare would finally be over. But then something strange happened. The moment the sirens became audible, the man turned. Slowly, almost casually, he stepped back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I could still see his outline for a few moments longer as he walked away, his figure blending into the night. And then he was gone. The police arrived minutes later, their lights flashing as they pulled up to the house. I ran downstairs to let them in, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. They came inside, asking me questions, trying to piece together what had happened. I told them everything, the footsteps, the man in the backyard, how he had vanished into the trees the moment he heard them coming. The officers did a thorough search of the property, shining their flashlights into every corner of the yard and the woods beyond. But just like before, they found nothing. No sign of the man, no footprints in the mud, nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a kind face, tried to reassure me. "Sometimes people get spooked," he said. "Maybe he was just a drifter, looking for shelter. The rain can make things seem worse than they are." But I knew better. I knew what I had seen. And I knew he wasn't just a drifter. The police stayed for a while longer, patrolling the neighborhood and checking the nearby woods. But as the hours dragged on, it became clear that they weren't going to find anything. Eventually, they left, leaving me alone in the house once more. I locked every door and window again, checking and rechecking, even though I knew it wouldn't matter. He had already been inside once, and I had no doubt he could get in again if he wanted to. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed up, sitting by the window, watching the backyard, waiting for any sign of movement. But the man didn't return. Not that night, and not the next. In the weeks that followed, I tried to go back to normal, but things were different now. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment.